Hey everybody, my name is Dr. Pat Lawrence. I'm going to talk to you today about obscenity studies, which is a subfield within English literary studies, and it's my research specialty. I hope I can give you something new and interesting today. Let's find out. So, what is obscenity studies? In the broadest sense, I study books that get banned, and then I study what happens when they get banned and why certain ones get banned, and overall what we can learn from the fact that they got banned and how it went. Now, this work is interdisciplinary, which means it draws on a lot of fields outside of English, which actually makes the work really interesting and fun, but also kind of challenging. I work with a lot of history. I work with the law, especially because I study constitutional issues related to free speech and Supreme Court rulings about constitutional issues. I also study photographs as well as comics and images and movies, in addition to literary novels and plays. And then my work intersects with gender studies, also sexuality studies, and ethnic studies. So that keeps it really lively, but it gives me a lot of reading to do. Now I'm going to minimize this video, and we'll dig a little bit deeper. Okay, so what is obscenity? Obscenity is a form of censorship, so let's start with censorship. Censorship is when some official or a body steps in to say that something can't be said or published or sold. Now, we usually think of censorship in this broad sense as anytime you feel like you can't say something or you feel like you'll get punished if you say it. But censorship, it's important to remember, is an official or government act, at least in its formal capacity. So though we think of the US as fundamentally committed to free speech, a country where you can say whatever you want and people toss around all sorts of ideas, actually, until the middle of the last century, in the 20th century, censorship by the government was pretty common. Lots of cities, lots of states had laws that said certain kinds of things couldn't be published, and that included things like criticism of the government, certain kinds of sexual content, certain kinds of things, for example, that disparaged the police, and certain political positions. So actually there was a lot of official censorship in the US until about the middle of the 20th century, when that all changed with a series of Supreme Court decisions that rolled back obscenity laws between 1957 and 1973. And that was happening at the same time that we saw a lot of other kinds of social change, including the civil rights movement. As a result of these changes, official censorship in the US is actually very rare now. So really, the government very, very rarely steps in to say that some things can't be said or that some things can't be published. And we don't have government officials seizing shipments of books, for example. Instead, what's a lot more common now is forms of soft censorship. Soft censorship is when ideas don't circulate or they feel like they're not, like we can't air them, but it's not an official act. And this happens in lots of different ways. For example, school and library challenges, which is when someone decides that they would like a library to not stock a particular book, or they don't want a book taught in schools. Also protests at plays and art exhibits, when people come and they say, hey, you shouldn't see this, or we find this offensive or frustrating. Also censorship-related vandalism. This is when people go to libraries and bookstores, for example, and cut passages out or even steal books that they find offensive to destroy them. Also, any limits on distribution. This is when, say, a book can only be sold from behind a counter, or when we actually think of as movie ratings as a kind of censorship in the sense that it limits the availability of certain kinds of content. And then sometimes in this category we include self-censorship. This is a little bit of a tricky aspect of it. But it's the notion that we ourselves limit what we will say because we're afraid of public rebukes because of that. Now, this isn't exactly censorship all of the time, because really when we express views, we have to expect other people to disagree sometimes. And the fear of that is a sort of natural part of sharing our ideas. But this can be considered a form of self-censorship. Okay, so obscenity, it's a subcategory of censorship. And it's not just swear words. Sometimes we use the word obscenity to mean when you're using a curse word, but that's not what it is in a legal sense. Generally, in a legal sense, it has to do with material that deals with sexuality in a way that whatever censoring body deems to be offensive. So this is actually a passage here from my book, and it says, In the legal context, the term's definition is limited narrowly to sexual material of an offensive nature that is not afforded First Amendment protections. In common parlance, the definition is much broader. One routinely hears, for example, of people who are obscenely wealthy or food that was obscenely delicious. No matter which way the term is used, it connotes behavior that goes too far, and thus it is judged by the speaker to violate standards of decency. What constitutes too far and what defines decency, however, are up for debate, and this is true no matter the venue, and regardless of whether the debate is between a prosecutor and a publisher, or between a preacher and a plutocrat. So we have this general popular sense that obscene means too much or too far, and that's really part of it. In a legal sense, what we mean is that it goes too far in the way that it depicts some kind of sexual content. All right, it's a lot more than that, though. When we talk about obscenity, we're actually talking about a lot of different kinds of social processes. So, starting from the left, obscenity can also be a media category. So it's a term that defines art that contains offensive sexual material and lacks social value. That's part of the legal definition. But it's also a legal history. So when we talk about obscenity, we talk about changes from early laws called the Comstock Acts to the Miller ruling. And we talk about this gradual opening of American society from a very restrictive society to one that permits a lot more kinds of ideas and representations. But obscenity can also be a political tactic. And that's because when people are getting really worked up about obscenity and talking about morality in media, often they're using it as an appeal to certain kinds of voters, people who are really concerned about American society and its values. And so this can actually be a political ploy. It's also a marketing ploy, because some publishers like to play up the taboo nature or the risque nature of their material, because that generates a lot of publicity, which leads to sales. And then last, it's also a power play. A lot of times, obscenity charges, especially if they result in actual criminal charges, these have a lot to do with stifling dissent. When something is challenged or when something is banned, it's often because the voice that's saying these things, or the position being represented, is that of a social outsider. So these are positions that are not popular, and sometimes the obscenity charges can be used to stifle those voices. All right, so why do we care about all this stuff? Why is it more than just one little narrow subsection of literature? Well, that's because it matters what gets banned, and we can learn a lot from studying it. So obscenity can illuminate, for example, literary history and canonization. So we can learn a lot about books like Ulysses that were originally banned, and what it is about those books that caused them to be banned, and how that reflects how we value certain kinds of books and certain kinds of content. It also can illuminate transatlantic cultural history. What do I mean by that? I mean the history of how we share culture with countries on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. So, in particular, a book that I'm going to talk about in a minute, Henry Miller's Tropic of Cancer, was originally banned in the United States, despite the fact that Miller was an American. But the book was published in France. And then, during World War II, American GIs got copies of that book, and they brought it home with them. And so we learn a lot about American culture and World War II and all of the interactions between the US and France and England by studying obscenity and the books that are at the center of those controversies. Similarly, we can learn a lot about contemporary and recent culture wars. So anytime you hear about people sort of getting very worked up about the direction of our society, a lot of times this has to do with obscenity or morality, and this teaches us what people value and what kinds of political debates are happening. It also reflects pedagogical politics, so the politics of schools. What do we teach? Who do we teach? Who chooses what we teach? All of these things are affected by obscenity debates because they often play out in school challenges. And then last, it can teach us about racism and representation, and that's because, unfortunately, a lot of books that get banned are banned because of the way they represent cross-racial desire, or the way that they represent relationships between people of different races. Also, books that are banned, often these bans target minority or marginalized authors. All right, Let's talk about what happens when a book is challenged or banned. It's probably not quite what you expect. First, some person or a group might decide they dislike a text, a book or a novel or a play or something, and they may file a complaint with a local school board or with a library or try to organize protests. Basically, we have someone who gets upset about a book, who thinks that it contains offensive or problematic content, and they want to do something about it. So they lodge some kind of a complaint. For a lot of reasons that are kind of complex to get into, these actions often target political dissenters and members of marginalized groups. This isn't always the intent of the people challenging texts, but it's often the effect, and the reasons, again, are really complex. This is frustrating because those targeted authors can often suffer. They have to deal with a lot of extra legal costs and a lot of publicity that maybe they weren't ready to welcome. This can sometimes, and I want to stress sometimes, result in an individual school dropping a book from its reading list, or maybe offering students an optional text they can do instead of the one that has been challenged. Or a particular store might stop stocking a book, or an individual who hears about this might choose not to read the book. But such bans almost never produce widespread or long-lasting restrictions in the United States. An attempted challenge or an attempted act of censorship almost never actually stifles distribution or access to the book, and that's because of the legal framework we have in place now. Instead, in the long run, the attention that the controversy generates tends to create public interest, and that causes people to buy the book, and it creates a lot of scholarly commentary. So people come out in defense of the book, or they write articles talking about why the book is valuable, with the result that we get lots of media attention and books written about it. And that leads to increased sales and eventually canonization. So contrary to what censors might intend, a lot of times a censorship controversy actually increases sales and leads to canonization. And then often, these benefits are not equal. So while some things can happen that benefit authors and publishers, this tends to benefit privileged classes. They tend to be perceived as daring or innovative when they break these rules or violate taboos. But disadvantaged classes tend to be judged by prejudiced stereotypes. So their work, they might also have increased sales, but it's also going to run into these controversies about responsible representation, and often that draws on stereotypes. All right, so I wrote a book about this. It's called Obscene Gestures, Counter-Narratives of Sex and Race in the 20th Century, and it involves a bunch of different case studies of books that were banned and how we can tell the differences in their reception by studying them together in these pairs. So I use 4 different pairings. The first is Tropic of Cancer and Native Son. I'll talk about that in a second. The next are famous novels from Thomas Pynchon and Toni Morrison, then from Kathy Acker and Alice Walker, and then finally a big play, a monumental play by Tony Kushner, and a very famous photo exhibition by Robert Mapplethorpe. I'm only going to talk about the first one here for a second. So here are my case study, sort of as a small miniature version of what I talk about in the book. And it's the first chapter of the book. I talk about Henry Miller's Tropic of Cancer, published in 1934, like I said, in France. It was banned in the United States. It was banned in England. But then soldiers in World War II eventually were bringing it back over. And there were lots of black market copies, and there was a big black market demand for it. And it was all over the place, and people knew about it. But you couldn't officially buy copies until the 50s, when it actually won an important case at the Supreme Court, when the publisher won that case. Richard Wright is the author of Native Son, published in 1940. It was the first book chosen by the Book of the Month Club by an African American, but it had to be abridged, and I'll talk about that in a second. You can actually see there in the picture that it says the abridged edition. It wasn't restored. The full text, according to Wright's original vision, wasn't restored until the 1990s. So my first chapter of the book considers Miller's Tropic of Cancer and Wright's Native Son, which highlight the most common scripts for obscene texts reception. What I mean by that is that later in the century, as we move toward our current time, lots of other pairs of books will follow this same script. The same sorts of things will happen to them. So while it was banned in the US, Miller's Tropic of Cancer catalyzed a legal process that cemented the book's status as a literary event. In fact, Miller became very important in the US counterculture. He's not read very much now, and he's fallen out of favor for some good reasons, but for a while he was a huge celebrity. In contrast, in order for the Book of the Month Club to make Native Son its first work by an African American, several passages from the original manuscript had to be cut at their request. And those resulting omissions diluted the novel's challenge to racial norms and diminished the psychological complexity of the main character. So while Miller's book remained aesthetically intact with all of its challenging content, Wright's book had to be cut down. It became much more simplistic, and in many ways, it pathologized the characters in the book in a way that Wright never intended. However, both the books did become major, huge literary events. We still teach them today. People still buy and read them today. And both authors ultimately became part of the American canon, literary canon. All right, so let me start to pull back and give you some big picture insights here. First, by studying what gets banned, why it gets banned, and what happens after it gets banned, we can learn a lot about literature and society. I mentioned transatlantic history and racism and all sorts of things. Obscenity studies also has to include insights from many different fields, including gender and sexuality studies, ethnic studies, and the law. It's an interdisciplinary field, which makes it really exciting. And what's the big takeaway? What's the story of an obscenity challenge that I want you to remember? First, though official censorship is really rare in the United States, it still does exist, and it has real negative impacts. It can still be very frustrating for authors and publishers. However, contrary to its intent, censorship almost never results in actually limiting distribution of a book. Instead, it drives sales and canonization. But it's important to remember that these benefits are not equal, and the paths taken by majority authors versus marginalized authors are not the same. All right, so I hope that you've learned something interesting or unusual, or maybe just learned about this interesting and unusual subset of American literary studies. Thanks for your time and attention, and thanks to the USCL Research Club.